Nobody thought a routine pregame segment would turn into one of the most electric moments of the season. But that's exactly what happened. What started as a standard panel discussion exploded into a live confrontation that peeled back the curtain on everything simmering beneath Cleveland's surface. Power struggles, mixed messages, and a quarterback who finally refused to be talked down to. For once, this wasn't just hot takes and punditry. It was context meeting consequence on national television. Shador Sanders stepped into his first real start with a full week of reps and a game plan built around him. The shot at redemption he'd been denied for months. Instead of getting built up, he'd been repeatedly questioned on air by a veteran voice that's been loud all season. That's why the exchange felt seismic. It wasn't just a debate about talent. It was a dispute over fairness, responsibility, and who gets blamed when things go wrong. On that show, an analyst cut through the noise and accused the organization of systemic failures. Rex Ryan pushed back. Shedeur spoke. The room shifted. For viewers, it went from commentary to a reckoning, a moment where the media narrative and the players' reality collided in real time. And what came out of that collision changes how you see this whole story, not just as a game, but as a test of leadership, culture, and who controls the story. What made this moment so explosive wasn't just the argument itself. It was why it happened and when it happened. Shador Sanders wasn't stepping into a random midseason game or cleaning up someone else's mess. He was finally being handed something he had earned months ago, a full week as the unquestioned starter. A game plan built around his strengths and a chance to show who he really is without being thrown into chaos. For the first time all year, the environment was controlled, the preparation was real, and the opportunity was finally his. That alone made this week one of the biggest moments of his young career. Everyone around the league knew how much was riding on this. Fans were watching, teammates were paying attention. The Browns organization had eyes locked on him, and in the middle of that pressure, Rex Ryan kept pushing the exact same storyline he'd been repeating all season. That Shedeur wasn't ready, wasn't steady, and wasn't built for the moment he was about to face. That's why the confrontation hit so hard. Rex didn't just offer critiques. He presented his doubts as the default reality, the version of the story everyone should accept. But the second the analyst dug deeper, it was clear things weren't that simple. One voice on the panel broke through the noise and pointed directly at the real issue. Shedeur had never been put into a fair situation. His earlier appearance came with no cadence work, no preparation, no chemistry with the first team. A setup that would make any rookie look out of rhythm. And that truth cracked open everything. For months, fans speculated about miscommunication inside the building. Rumors suggested the coaching staff wasn't aligned with the front office. Some even believed Shedeur's development was being mishandled from the start. Hearing an analyst echo those concerns on live TV didn't just validate those thoughts, it amplified them. Suddenly, the question wasn't, is Shedeur ready? It became, was he ever given a real chance to be? And that shift in perspective is what set the stage for the fireworks that followed. The spark that truly lit the fuse came from a moment nobody saw coming. A single line delivered so cleanly, so confidently, that it instantly flipped the entire tone of the broadcast. As Rex Ryan repeated his usual criticisms, laying out the same doubts he'd been airing for weeks, one analyst finally snapped the cycle. He didn't raise his voice, didn't get emotional, didn't try to shout over anyone. He simply looked into the camera and said, respectfully, "I don't give a damn." That line didn't just land, it detonated, because behind it wasn't disrespect. It was frustration. It was months of watching a young quarterback become the face of problems he didn't create. And for the first time on national television, someone was willing to say Shedeur wasn't set up to succeed. Not in Baltimore, not in practice, not in the system he was dropped into. And pretending otherwise wasn't honest commentary. It was narrative building. The analyst doubled down, making it clear that what happened in Shedeur's first appearance wasn't normal or acceptable. A quarterback entering a game without cadence reps? No timing routes practiced with the starters? No preparation for the moment he was thrown into? He looked right at Rex and said exactly what many online had been saying for weeks. There's no way that happens by accident. He didn't accuse anyone directly, but he didn't have to. He framed it exactly the way high-retention drama demands. I'm not saying it was intentional, but it sure didn't look unintentional. And that's when the broadcast flipped from analysis to confrontation. Rex tried to push back, insisting the responsibility still fell on Shedeur. But the energy in the room had already shifted. The panel wasn't buying it. They weren't letting the conversation sit on surface-level critiques anymore. They were digging into the bigger question, the question Rex kept avoiding. If the organization failed the quarterback, why was the quarterback the only one being blamed? The audience felt it. Social media felt it. Even Rex looked thrown off, because suddenly, he wasn't the one steering the narrative. The truth was. And that's exactly when Shedeur decided to speak for himself. When Shedeur finally opened his mouth, the entire atmosphere of the broadcast shifted. Up until that point, it was analysts going back and forth, voices clashing, narratives competing for dominance. But the moment Shedeur stepped in, everything got quiet. Not because he demanded attention, but because the calm in his voice cut deeper than any argument thrown at him. He didn't match Rex Ryan's energy. He didn't fire back with anger. He didn't try to defend himself like someone desperate for approval. Instead, he spoke with the certainty of someone who knows exactly what he's capable of and knows that the people doubting him don't have the full picture. He explained how he prepared, what this week meant, how different it felt to finally have a game plan built for him instead of being thrown into chaos. He talked about timing, reads, communication, the details analysts love to ignore when they're busy constructing a narrative. And instead of sounding overwhelmed, he sounded composed, steady, in control. The kind of composure that makes critics nervous because it doesn't fit the version of the story they've been selling. What rattled Rex wasn't Shedeur's confidence, it was the way he delivered it. Shedeur didn't try to convince anyone, he simply stated facts. He talked about the work he put in, the preparation he finally received, and the belief he has in himself. A belief he made clear isn't dependent on media approval. He even said, without hesitation, that he knows he's the guy. Not because of hype or headlines or outside validation, but because players at his level don't survive without real confidence. That's when you could feel the room tense up. Analysts paused. Rex's expression changed. For the first time, the narrative didn't revolve around what people thought Shedeur was. It revolved around what he actually said he is. And hearing him speak for himself brought something into the light that criticism never addressed: the mental toughness. Maturity and clarity that have carried him through pressure most rookies never face. But the impact didn't stop there. Because once Shedeur finished speaking, the conversation turned to something even bigger. Something that forced everyone watching to reevaluate what was really going on behind closed doors in Cleveland. The moment Shedeur finished speaking, the conversation took a sharp turn, away from him and straight toward the Cleveland Browns organization. It was almost as if his clarity forced everyone to stop debating the symptoms and start looking directly at the disease. And once the panel finally started peeling back those layers, What came out was the kind of uncomfortable truth that organizations hate seeing exposed on national television. One analyst wasted no time pointing out the staggering pattern. Since 1999, ... Every single rookie quarterback who made their first start for the Browns lost. 17 straight failures, 17 quarterbacks walking into the exact same trap. And now, Shedeur was about to become number 18. When you see a pattern that consistent, it stops being about individual talent. It becomes a question of structural failure, a question of leadership, a question of whether the system itself is broken. But that wasn't the only point being made. Rumors had been circulating long before this interview. Whispers about tension between the coaching staff and the front office. Disagreements about quarterback development. Conflicting visions on how to handle Shedeur's progression. Nothing confirmed, but enough smoke for analysts to finally acknowledge it on air. They framed it carefully. Reports claim, some around the league believe. There's been talk internally, but even with cautious wording, the message was clear. Something inside the building isn't aligned, and that misalignment had consequences. The panel revisited the haunting detail from Shedeur's first appearance. Multiple offensive linemen admitted they didn't know his cadence. No chemistry with the starters. No timing work, no preparation. Whether caused by miscommunication or something deeper, it painted a picture of a rookie being thrown into an impossible situation, then being blamed for the collapse that followed. Rex tried to redirect the conversation back to Shedeur's readiness, but his voice didn't hit the same. Because once the analysts shined a light on the organization's role, his narrative didn't hold the same weight. The room wasn't asking if Shedeur failed the moment. They were asking if the Browns failed him. And just as that question began to sink in, the panel introduced a new angle, one that made the entire situation even more personal. As the discussion dug deeper, the conversation shifted from organizational failure to something far more personal. The human side of what Shador Sanders has been carrying. Because behind the football debates, behind the statistics and the narratives, there's a young man navigating a level of pressure most rookies will never experience. And a huge part of that pressure comes from something he didn't choose, being Deion Sanders' son. For weeks leading up to his first real start, one of the most talked about storylines wasn't even about Shedeur's preparation. It was about whether Deion would show up to support him. To any other player, having a parent attend a game wouldn't be news. But Deion isn't just a parent. He's a headline, a camera magnet, a walking storyline. And with that comes noise. The kind of noise that can swallow a young quarterback's moment before he even steps onto the field. When reporters asked Deion about attending, his answer was unexpectedly vulnerable. He said he wanted to be there for his son. He said he knew how much it would mean for Shedeur to see him in the tunnel before kickoff. But he also admitted something heavier. He worried his presence might turn the moment into a media circus. That kind of self-awareness from a father, knowing that simply showing up might burden his son, says everything about the impossible line this family walks. And then came the detail that left the panel stunned. Reports surfaced that while Shedeur was preparing for the Baltimore game weeks earlier, his home was robbed. Chaos unfolding off the field while he was expected to perform on it. Yet Shedeur never used it as an excuse, never mentioned it, never asked for sympathy. He went right back to film, right back to studying, right back to preparing. That level of mental toughness became a turning point in the discussion. Analysts began questioning whether the criticism he'd been facing had completely ignored the reality of what he was dealing with. The pressure, the expectations, the personal battles, the weight of a famous last name. And just as the panel began reevaluating everything they thought they knew, the conversation turned toward the biggest truth of all. The moment Shedeur finally stepped onto the field to prove every narrative right or wrong. When kickoff finally arrived, all the talking stopped. The debates, the speculation, the criticism, none of it mattered anymore. For the first time all season, Shador Sanders walked onto the field not as a backup, not as an emergency replacement, but as the Cleveland Browns' true starting quarterback. And the weight of that moment was visible in the way he carried himself. Calm steps, steady eyes, zero hesitation. It wasn't the confidence of someone trying to prove a point. It was the confidence of someone who already knew the truth and was ready to let the world catch up. From the opening drive, every snap felt like a referendum. Every throw was an answer to a question someone had asked about him, and you could feel millions of eyes watching, waiting to see whether the rookie would crumble under the moment or rise above everything that had been thrown at him. The early plays revealed exactly why this moment mattered so much. The timing looked sharper, the reads were cleaner, the offense, for the first time, seemed tailored to his rhythm. Quick throws, controlled movement, easy progressions. It wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. What mattered was the composure, the way he shook off misses without flinching, the way he stood tall against pressure instead of retreating, the way he looked like someone who finally had a system supporting him instead of working against him. And the most telling part came from the reactions around him. Analysts who had spent weeks questioning his readiness suddenly shifted their tone. Instead of asking whether he belonged, they were pointing out the flashes, the anticipation throws, the poise, the confidence. Meanwhile, the few who still doubted him could feel the narrative slipping away, because the kid they said wasn't ready looked nothing like the version they'd been attacking. But the real drama wasn't what happened on the field. It was what the performance meant. Because as the game unfolded, one thing became clear. This wasn't just a test of Shador Sanders. It was a test of the entire narrative built around him. And when the final whistle blew, the studio was about to erupt all over again, louder and more divided than before. When the broadcast cut back to the studio after the final whistle, it was immediately clear that the game didn't settle anything. It ignited a whole new firestorm. The analysts weren't easing into polite post-game reactions. They came in hot, ready to dissect every second of Shedur's performance. And the split between the panel was sharper than ever. The first analyst to speak didn't mince words. He pointed out exactly what viewers had seen with their own eyes. When Shedeur finally got a real week of preparation, he didn't fall apart. He delivered. He executed. And he handled pressure like someone who'd been waiting his whole life for the moment. That analyst emphasized the things critics conveniently overlooked. The sharper timing, the improved footwork, the patience in the pocket, and the confidence that never wavered even when things got messy. But the real shock was how quickly Rex Ryan tried to reclaim control of the narrative. Instead of acknowledging the improvement, he went right back to his familiar talking points. Inexperience, mistakes, not ready yet. It felt like he'd written his reaction before the game even started. But this time, the rest of the table wasn't giving him the space to repeat the same storyline. Another analyst jumped in and called out the selective criticism. He pointed out how unfair it was to judge Shedeur's mistakes without mentioning the progress. He highlighted that Shedeur looked noticeably more composed, more confident, and more connected with the offense than he did during his chaotic debut. And that wasn't luck. That was preparation. That was coaching. That was what happens when a player is finally given the resources he needs. And then came the part that really shook the room. The speculation. Not wild accusations. Carefully framed hints. Phrases like, "There's been buzz around the league." Some people inside the building believe. Reports claim not everyone was on the same page earlier this season. The implication was subtle but unmistakable. Some observers believed Shedur's struggles weren't just on him. They were the product of misalignment inside the Browns organization. And the more analysts talked, the more viewers realized something important. This conversation was no longer about a rookie quarterback proving himself. It was about whether the system around him ever gave him a fair chance to begin with. And just as the arguments reached their peak, there was one final twist that pushed the story into an entirely different territory. By the time the debate reached its final moments, it became clear that this story was no longer just about Shador Sanders versus Rex Ryan. It wasn't even about a single game or a single performance. It had evolved into something much bigger, a clash between perception and reality, between media narratives and on-field truth, between the loudest voices in the room and the young quarterback they tried to define before he ever had a fair chance. As the analysts wrapped up their arguments, the tone shifted from fiery to reflective. You could feel that everyone, even Rex, whether he admitted it or not, recognized that the conversation had moved into deeper territory. One analyst summed it up perfectly. "We didn't just watch a quarterback grow today. We watched the narrative around him crack open." And that's exactly what happened. For weeks, the story had been shaped by doubt, criticism, and speculation. But the moment Shedeur finally got a real opportunity, the script changed. Not because the media allowed it, but because he forced it to change through composure, preparation, and resilience. Another analyst pointed out something even more important. This wasn't the end of the Shador Sanders story. It was the beginning, a foundation, a turning point. Whether people want to admit it or not, he had shown he belonged in the conversation. Not as a project, not as a placeholder, but as a quarterback with the mentality and maturity to handle the weight that Cleveland placed on him. Rex tried one last time to push his doubts, but for the first time all night, his voice didn't carry the room. The energy had shifted. The old narrative no longer fit, and the audience could see it. Fans online were already choosing sides, already arguing, already preparing for whatever came next. Because once a moment like this happens on live TV, it doesn't disappear. It grows, it evolves, it becomes bigger than the people involved. The final takeaway wasn't whether Shedeur proved himself or whether the Browns suddenly had everything figured out. It was that the spotlight had moved, the questions had changed, and the pressure wasn't just on Shedeur anymore. It was on Cleveland. Because now the world has seen what he looks like with real preparation. Now the world has heard him speak for himself. And now the world is watching closely to see whether the organization builds on this moment or lets history repeat itself. One thing is certain. Whatever happens next in this unfolding saga, people won't be watching quietly. They'll be watching loudly. They'll be watching passionately. And they'll be watching with the memory of this explosive moment still echoing in their minds.